Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 13, JS Mill, and our topic is representative government. Mill began his representative government by stating that we can only decide which is the best form of government by examining which form of government fulfills most adequately the purpose of government. For Mill, the point of having a government was that of if performed two main functions, it must use the existing qualities and skills of the citizens to best serve their interest, and it must improve the moral, intellectual, and active qualities of these citizens. A despotic government may be able to fulfill the first purpose but will fail in the second. Only a representative government is able to fulfill these two functions. It is a representative government that combines judicially the two principles of participation and competence, which is able to fulfill the two functions of protecting and educating the citizens. Let us look more carefully at what Mill had to say about the first function of government. Mill began his discussion of this subject by introducing Bentham's concept of sinister interest. How does representative government ensure that the common interest of society is being furthered, instead of the partial and sinister interest of some groups or class? Even though Mill distinguishes between short-term and long-term interest, he was certain that every individual and every class is the best judge of its own interest. He scolded at the idea that some human beings may not be aware of their real interest, retorting that given these persons' current habits and dispositions, what they choose are their real interest. It follows then that the participation in the political process must be as extensive as possible, so that every individual has a say in controlling the government and thus protecting his interest. It is on this basis that Mill demanded the right to vote for women. He advocated the extension of the suffrage to cover everyone except those who could not read and write, did not pay taxes, or were on parish relief. It was this same impetus for wanting everyone to be represented that made Mill support Hayes' system of proportional representation for electing deputies to Parliament. Under the current system, Mill pointed out, minorities went unrepresented, and since they too needed to protect their interest, another electoral mechanism should be found to ensure their representation. Whereas his belief in participation led him to advocate a widening of the franchise, his belief on competence led him to recommend plural voting. In fact, he said that the franchise should be not be widened without plural voting being introduced. Plural voting meant that with everyone having at least one vote, some individuals would have more than one vote because they were, for example, more educated. It assumed a graduated scale of educational attainments, awarding at the bottom one additional vote to the skilled laborers and two to the foremen, and at the top as many as five to professional men, writers and artists, public functionaries, university graduates, and members of learned society. Plural voting would ensure that a better caliber of deputies would be elected, and so the general interest would not be hampered by the poor quality of members of parliament. Mill sought to combine his two principles in other institutions of representative democracy as well. Take the Representative Assembly, for instance. Mill said that this body must be a committee of grievances and a congress of opinion. Every opinion existed in the nation should find a voice here. That is how every group's interests have a better chance of being protected. At the same time, Mill argued that this body was suited neither for the business of legislation nor of administration. Legislation was to be framed by a codification commission made up of a few competent legal experts. Administration should be in the hands of bureaucracy, an institution characterized by instrumental competence, that is, the ability to find the most efficient means to fulfill given goals. Mill's arguments employed two kinds of competence: instrumental and moral. Instrumental competence is the ability to discover the best means to certain ends, and the ability to identify ends that satisfy individuals' interests as they perceive them. Moral competence is the ability to discern ends that are intrinsically superior for individuals and society. Morally competent leaders are able to recognize the general interest and resist the sinister interests that dwell not only in the government but also in the democratic majority. The purpose of plural voting is to ensure that morally competent leaders get elected into the legislature. What about the other goal of government, that of making the citizens intellectually and morally better? Again, it is a representative government that is based on a combination of participation and competence, which is able to improve the quality of its citizens in mental, moral, and practical aspects. Let us again look at some of the specific institutional changes recommended by Mill. He wanted to replace the secret ballot with open voting, that is, everyone must know how one has voted. For Mill, The franchise was not once right in the sense of, for example, the right to property, which implies that one can dispose of one's property in any arbitrary manner. The franchise is a trust or a public duty, and one must cast one's vote for that candidate whose policies seem to best further the common interest. It is the need to justify one's vote to others that makes the vote an instrument of one's intellectual and moral growth. Otherwise, one would use one's vote arbitrarily, voting, for instance, for someone because of the color of his eyes. Everyone must have the franchise, but it must be open. This is how Mill combined the principle of participation and competence in the suffrage to ensure the improvement of the voting citizens. We find here the motive of improvement again. Representative government scores over despotism not because it better protects the given interest of the citizens, but because it is able to improve these citizens. The citizens develop their capabilities by being able to participate in government, minimally by casting their vote, and also by actually taking decisions in local government. At the same time, this participation is leavened by the principle of competence to ensure that the political experience does have an educational effect. Next point is beyond utilitarianism. Having looked separately at three texts, let us bring out some general themes on Mill's writing. Mills never gave up his self characterization as a utilitarian, no matter how far his principles seem to have moved away from that creed. When he spoke about rights, for instance, he subsumed rights under the concept of utility, defining rights as nothing else but some extremely important utilities. As we all know, Mill's father, James Mill, was the closest associate of Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism. J.S. Mill grew up in the shadow of utilitarianism, and even after his emotional crisis in his early 20s, he managed to write a defense of utilitarianism. Throughout his work, we have seen him applying the standard of utility. When consideration for giving equality to women was that it would increase their happiness, the principle of liberty was defended on the ground of its social utility. Social progress depended on individual freedom. A modified liberal democracy was characterized as the best form of government because of its usefulness. Utilitarianism 1862 is the slim tract which Mill put together to answer all objections that had been raised against this philosophy. The work begins by Mill pointing out that there has been, over the centuries, little agreement on the criteria of differentiating rights from wrong, rejecting the idea of human beings having a moral sense like our sense of sight or smell, which can sense what is right in concrete cases. Mill put forward the criteria of utility or the greatest happiness principle as the basis of morality. That action is moral, which increases pleasure and diminishes pain. In defending utilitarianism here, Mill made a significant change for Bentham's position. Pleasure is to be counted not only in terms of quantity but also in terms of quality. A qualitatively higher pleasure is to count for more than lower pleasures. It is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasures are more desirable and more valuable than others. It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Having responded to the criticism that utilitarianism assumes an animal like human nature, Mill moved to the next serious problem. Why would individuals be interested in the happiness of others? Mill answered in terms of the social feeling of mankind, the desire to be in unity with our fellow creatures, a powerful principle of human nature, because the social state is at once so natural, so necessary, and so habitual to men. Mill believed that our taking an interest in others' happiness was not questionable at all. Finally, the only objection that Mill took seriously was that justice instead of utility is the foundation of morality. Mill's response was first to link justice with right, and injustice is done when someone's rights are violated, and then to assert that rights are to be defended because of their utility. To have a right, then, is to have something which society ought to defend me in the possession of. If the objector goes on to ask why I ought, I can give him no other reason than general utility. A society in which individuals are certain of enjoying their rights is the one which, according to Mill, is able to progress. Thus, rights do not replace the concept of utility. For Mill, utility was the justification for rights. Now, summary of the unit. Mill's liberalism provided the first major framework of modern democratic equality by extending the logic of the defense of liberty to end the subjection of women. As a member of parliament, he tried to push though a law allowing women to vote, and was disappointed when that did not happen. He was the first male philosopher, and O'Keefe points out, to write about women's oppression and subjugation. He also portrayed the wide diversity in our society and cautioned the need to protect the individual from the fear of intruding his private domain by a collective group of or people of public opinion. The distinction between self regarding and other regarding action would determine the individual's private independent sphere and the later the individual's social public sphere. He stressed on the need to protect the rights of minority within a democracy. He understood the shortcomings of classical utilitarian liberalism and advocated vigorously for important state actions in providing compulsory state education and state control, realizing that his scheme is very different from that of Bentham. He also described himself as a socialist. His revision of liberalism provided the impetus to T. H. Green, who combining the British liberal tradition with the continental one provided a new basis of liberalism with his notion of common good. It might be apposite here to cite his characterization in the autobiography of his later development away from democracy and towards socialism. I was a Democrat, but not least of a socialist. We were now much less democratic than I had been, but our ideal of ultimate improvement went far beyond democracy and would class us decidedly under the general designation of socialist. The social problem of the future we consider to be how to unite the greatest individual liberty of action with a common ownership in the raw material of the globe and an equal participation of all in the benefits of combined labor. If these are the requisites of the greatest happiness of the greatest number, the link between capitalism and democracy had become questionable for the later mill.